this, show and everything we do is awesome, but all of it was really started so that we could report on the incredible wins that our legal team was having. That's all that the High Wire was about. We were winning in court, we were beating the government, we were revealing things that nobody knew was true. And then we were like, well, how is the world going to know about CNN's not reporting on, not MSNBC or Fox or anybody else? Well, we decided it's time to have our own show. That's how this all started, the High Wire. Why did it start? Because one of our powerhouses is the lawyer, the attorney that works for us, Siri. He just gave an incredible speech on the Senate floor in Arizona on the novel coronavirus at the Southwestern Intergovernmental Committee. And Siri joins me now. Aaron, it's great to see you. How you doing?
Good to see you, Dal.
Awesome. Look, but before we get into this incredible speech that you just gave, and it's being clipped and going viral all over the country. First of all, I just want to say I'm getting really pumped for Freedom Fest. I mean, we're going to have this opportunity. It's the first time you and I think we'll ever be on stage. Have we ever been on stage and having a chat in front of an audience? I don't think we've done that yet, have we?
I believe this will be the first time.
All right, so there it is, folks. If you want to see Siri and Del Beatry on stage, you better be at Freedom Fest. We're going to be doing this on the main stage on Friday, July 14th. You can still get your tickets. It's going to be an awesome event. You have time to get in there and see this live. And by the way, let's bring our people. I mean, we're about to take over Freedom Fest, right? We were there last year. It was awesome. We're going to be doing a live show the day before from Freedom Fest, and then we're going to have this incredible panel. And I'm also giving a talk on the same day, so it should be a lot of fun. All right, let's get to this talk that you just gave recently on the state Senate floor in Arizona. First of all, what was the sort of setup? Why were you asked to give this talk to begin with?
It was a 2-day event that was hosted by the Arizona Senate, as I understand it. It was held in one of their official committee rooms, and it was an official part of the Arizona Senate deliberations, as I understand it, meaning it was read into the Arizona State Senate record.
Okay.
And what they want to do was hold 2 days of effectively testimony by various individuals to talk about what really happened over the last few years vis-a-vis COVID and all its different, all the different issues. Yeah. And I was asked to come and talk about COVID-19 vaccines.
And when you were preparing for that, what was sort of your personal, I mean, you've done so much work for us. You're one of the most knowledgeable people now, just because the lawsuits we've had you file, all the data that is poured in from that, all the, whether it's, the V-Safe data and the Pfizer and Moderna data that you've gotten. I mean, you have really been on top of this. So how do you look at this mountain of information and narrow it down into a talk on the Senate floor?
Yeah. Well, they asked me beforehand to present on a number of topics regarding the COVID-19 vaccine, and those topics were very broad. So to your question, how do you narrow all that down?
Yeah.
All those questions really, when you think about them, V-Safe, VAERS, all the different issues around the vaccine, all the questions they were asking really came down to one question.
Okay.
Which is, how could this system that everybody relies upon be so broken? How could it fail us so badly? Most people who've never thought about vaccines a day in their life, right, got a first row seat into the rollout from beginning to end of a vaccine in a very, very narrow time frame, where normally it takes decades to, the whole idea of licensing and authorizing it and rolling it out.
Yeah.
And public uptake takes decades until there's even any significant portion of the society that has it. This happened very quickly in that regard.
Right.
So to understand the answer to that question, you really have to understand how vaccines have been treated in this country, especially in 1986. And so what I tried to do, and it was a great opportunity, because sitting on the panel right next to me was the head of the House Health Committee of Arizona,
okay,
as well as the deputy head and the head of the Senate Health Committee. Wow. So these are the two effectively most, powerful folks in Arizona that are going to dictate the laws and what gets out of committee vis-a-vis health laws in Arizona. And I had an opportunity to speak directly to them. And so I wanted them to understand not just about COVID-19 vaccines, because I think in many ways people, they see the problems, and they're left mystified at how this could happen, because you can't understand what went wrong with the COVID-19 vaccines until you understand the paradigm in which COVID-19 vaccines fell into. And to understand that, you got to understand how vaccines in general are treated from a regulatory perspective, economically, and so forth. And that is it's actually a really fascinating story, because it spans 40 something years. And I got an opportunity to tell it with a bunch of deposition videos and so forth. I tried to make it as fun as I could during the 2 hours that they sat there and listened to me talk.
Well, it's an incredible tour de force, Aaron, and we've decided to just play it in its entirety for many reasons. First of all, this is a conversation that we've had. A lot of the work that we did early on with ICANN was around the childhood vaccine program. COVID was just sort of this gift because, as you said, it woke up a lot of people to what you and I had discovered was a disastrous approach to making products and delivering them to our country. Just regulatory problems, manufacturing problems, no oversight, no proper safety trials. But everyone thought this was an anomaly, and I think that that's what you probably set straight here in front of the Arizona Senate. So without further ado, why don't we just go ahead and let you take the stage here. And for everyone that's watching, this is about to be one of the most thorough explanations of the entire vaccine issue you will ever get. It might make you uncomfortable if you're new to this show. Maybe this wasn't what you were prepared for, but this is something you have to see. You have to understand this, because this is what we need to change, and change it immediately. We are going to make these systems work better. That's what our lawsuits are all about, and the work and our legislative work is all about. Of course, Aaron, you've been at the center of it, so everybody grab some popcorn. Here we go. This is called the Novel Coronavirus Southwestern Intergovernmental Committee. This is on the Senate floor in Arizona. Enjoy.
My name is Aaron Siri. I'm an attorney. My firm has over 30 professionals that exclusively engage in vaccine-related work. I tell you that in full disclosure. Those professionals do vaccine injury claims, vaccine exemptions for military, immigration, school work, and vaccine policy work. I guess the unique nature of the vaccine policy practice we have is that we don't represent pharmaceutical companies. We bring the cases that typically are seeking to hold companies and the government accountable with regards to their work and practice related to vaccines. I was asked to come today and speak with regards to the 5 topics that are on the slide in front of you on the top right corner, with relation to data transparency, V-Safe and VAERS, clinical trials for mRNA vaccines, lack of informed consent, pharmaceutical immunity, and injuries and death related to COVID-19 vaccines. In looking at these 5 topics, to me, they all really come down to the same question I think I'm being asked to really talk about, which is, how could the system be so broken when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines? And that is the question I get all the time from people. I've got family members come up to me and say, my son or daughter, my spouse, my parents were either seriously injured or died after a COVID-19 vaccine. And how could it be that the very same people that I relied upon to get that shot, the very same medical organizations, medical institutions, public health authorities, who all told me, go get it, it's safe and effective, after there was an injury, and I went back to them and I pleaded and I cried sometimes, and I asked for help, they then told me, nothing to see here. Nope, it's an illusion. We're not seeing that signal. Your injury is anecdotal. And they don't get either help or not even recognition. These 5 topics that I was asked to talk about, to me, really do come back to that same question. How can it be that the injury is ignored? Because when most people go up to somebody and they say, I've been hurt, I've been injured, they get empathy, they get sympathy. But you add the word vaccine before injury, and you often get a very different reaction. Why? Well, to understand that, and to understand why COVID-19 vaccines and why public health authorities, why medical associations, why even cultural cognition around those products are so different than the way really most other products are treated, you need to understand the framework, regulatory and market, that COVID-19 vaccines fell into. COVID-19 vaccines didn't just fall into a vacuum, right? It's not like there was some tabula rasa plate that they just boop. No, COVID-19 vaccines fell into a very long-standing developed paradigm that exists in our country, in the United States and many parts of the world, with regards to how vaccines are treated and how they work, both treated by regulatory agencies and how market forces work with regards to those products. So we begin with a very simple question. How do we assure the safety of any product? Cars, planes, buildings, this microphone, that computer, in all forms, whether they're toxic, whether they can hurt you, whether they can leach chemicals, whether they can explode. How do we assure they're safe? The primary way we assure product safety in the United States and in all developed countries is self-regulation, market forces. Companies don't want to lose money. They want to make money. And when they are doing any conduct, they have a product that is going to cause them to lose money, they desist from those conduct, from those actions. But if there's conduct they can engage in to make money where there's no potential for liability, well, they usually take the shortest route to make as much profit as they can. Okay? So market forces are critical for assuring the safety of every product on the market. It's why your cars are safer. It's why planes are safer. It's why pretty much every consumer product around you is safer. The second way we assure product safety in this country and most parts of the developing world is regulatory agencies. It's a far, far weaker and less effective way to do it, but it's there. Next slide, please. So let's start with market regulation with regards to vaccines. Next slide, please. Here's the thing. When it comes to vaccines, in 1986, Congress, in its wisdom, passed something called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. And what this act did is it removed liability for injuries from vaccines, childhood vaccines, including if they're given to adults, so that pharmaceutical companies no longer were liable for injuries caused by their vaccine products. That is the law in this country since 1986. I am not aware of any other product. I can actually declaratorily say there is no other product that has that kind of immunity, period, full stop. Not planes, not drugs, not pretty much every product you interact with. Companies who make those products, sell those products, have you take them, they still have to be liable for the damages they cause. But when it comes to vaccines since 1986, the pharmaceutical company has not had any market force check of any significance on what they do when it comes to those products. We're going to talk more about that, but I just want you to really just absorb that for a second. Think of all the products out there that are dangerous, that could potentially hurt people. And the product you give immunity to is one you give to babies over and over again, an injection into the body? Next slide, please. Why were vaccine manufacturers granted immunity for the injuries their products cause? Well, in 1986, leading up to 1986, there were only 3 routine vaccines given to children in America. DTP, MMR, and OPV. 2 of those are injected, 1 is given orally. The amount of liability that those companies were facing from injuries from those products far exceeded the revenue that those products were bringing in. In fact, every manufacturer that was making them went bust or withdrew from the market, except for 1 manufacturer was left for each of those 3 shots, and that's it. The manufacturers threatened to stop making their products. Now, what normally happens when a product's causing more injury than good that it's doing it, as measured by dollars, which for better or worse is how we do it in this country. That's how we do it. We measure it by dollars. Well, usually they go make a better, safer product. Congress decided, however, in its infinite wisdom, that no, it's okay. You don't need to make your product safer. You don't need to make it better. We're just going to give you immunity so nobody could sue you. This way you could still make money from selling these products. That was the solution. You can keep selling your harmful products. That's fine, and you don't have to worry now about anybody suing you. That is what broke the market forces that assured product safety with regards to vaccines. But here's the real sin of that act, and I'll call it original sin. When they gave the immunity to the pharmaceutical companies, they didn't just do it for those 3 vaccines existing in 1986. They gave it for any vaccine that the pharmaceutical companies developed for children from that day forward. Okay? All right. Next slide, please. What has the impact been? The impact has been actually incredible. And let's start with clinical trials. On the left side of this chart, you could see that Pfizer's top 5 selling drugs of all time. Well, at least according to the website that I've linked to below. I haven't verified it, but that's what that website claims. Take a look at the orange chart. You could see those 5 drugs: Enbrel, Eliquis, PCB13, Lyrica, and Lipitor. You might notice that one is different than the others. For 4 out of those drugs, you had at least 2 years of safety review period. One had 4.9 years, 7.5 years almost, 6.6 years. And 4 of them had a placebo control in their clinical trials that were relied upon to license those products. One of them didn't. Guess what? You probably already guessed it. Which one's the vaccine among? There's only one vaccine on that list. PCB13, that's right. So when you look at that list, you can immediately see out of the top 5 drugs sold by Pfizer of all time, only one of them is a vaccine, and that is the one that had the shortest safety review period of half a year and did not have a placebo control group in the clinical trial relied on to license that shot. Take a look at the chart to the right. That is a list of all the vaccines given to babies in the first 6 months of life. Each of those vaccines is given 3 times in the first 6 months of life, 15 total shots. Take a look at the safety review period, often days or weeks, and there was none of them had a placebo control group, not a single one. By the way, you don't need to take my word for any of this. You can just go to the FDA website yourself, and we're going to do that in a second, and you can see all this data with your own eyes. That's the first impact, okay? The first impact that getting rid of market forces had, and it's incredibly critical, was that drug companies no longer had an incentive to really understand the safety profile of vaccines before they were licensed. With drugs, they want to know. If you put a drug on the market and it causes harm, the pharmaceutical companies have to pay. They want to know clearly what the safety profile is of a drug before it goes on the market. Because you put it on the market and they sell $3 billion worth of it, but they cause $10 billion worth of damages, they got to pay that $10 billion. That doesn't work out so well math-wise. But when a vaccine, when they're doing the clinical trial before it goes on the market, there is no concern about having to pay for damages. There is no incentive to look at it. It's not nefarious. It's not devious. It's just the economic structure that Congress created for them. Pharmaceutical companies are there to make money, and they will take the path of least resistance to get there. In fact, if they don't do that, I'm not sure they're actually doing what they're supposed to do vis-a-vis their shareholders. These 2 charts, I think, make that crystal clear, the impact on clinical trials by getting rid of market forces. Next slide, please. And why are clinical trials so important? Here's why. After a vaccine or drug is put on the market and licensed, if you then want to do a placebo-controlled trial, they tell you it's unethical. It's unethical to withhold the vaccine from any child because it's now a licensed product. So you can't do a placebo-controlled trial after it's licensed. And without a placebo-controlled trial, they tell you, typically, you can never establish causation between an alleged injury and the product. The only thing you can do after licensure typically are what's known as retrospective, typically epidemiological studies. You take historical data, you look backwards, and you do these studies, but they say those can never prove causation. So it's an incredible system. You license a product without a proper clinical trial, and then after it's licensed, you say you can never do one because it's unethical. And anybody who claims an injury, you can just say it's correlation, not causation, because you don't have a clinical trial with placebo. Next slide, please. Just to be clear, I'm showing you all this not to take issue with other vaccines, but I want to explain the paradigm in which COVID-19 vaccines fell into, okay? Let's take a look at one of the vaccines, and we'll just start at the very first vaccine on the childhood schedule, hepatitis B. That is the childhood schedule by the CDC, and you can see in the very first shot there is hepatitis B given at birth, right when they come out into the world on the first day, then at 1 month, and then at 6 months. Next slide, please. This is the package insert for the hepatitis B vaccine given to babies on the very first day of life. Okay, this is from the FDA website. And in section 6.1 of every package insert, that's that piece of paper, and every drug and vaccine you get, it's a big piece of paper. Yep, blank one right there for, if that meant it was EUA. And in section 6.1, under the federal regulations, the pharmaceutical company must summarize the clinical trial experience. It's required to do so by law. Let's read together exactly what the clinical trial was that was relied upon to license this hepatitis B given to one-day-old babies. Now think about this. You're giving the shot to a one-day-old baby, okay? Asthma is not usually diagnosed till a few years of age. Developmental disorders are not diagnosed till they're usually in school. Autoimmune, all kinds of issues often take years to assess, especially with the baby. You know, you've ever seen one that's really small. They don't talk. They can't really explain what's wrong. You'd expect the safety review period would at least be years. Well, let's read it. In 3 clinical studies, 434 doses of Recombivac's HB 5 micrograms were administered to 147 healthy infants and children up to 10 years of age who monitored for 5 days after each dose. There are 3 markers of a clinical trial that you typically look at to see if it's good. 1, how many people are in the trial? How robust is it? Right? Meaning, it's 147 folks, children up to 10 years of age. It is not what what epidemiologists and statisticians would call properly powered to assess anything. Okay. 2, even if it was properly powered by having enough children, 5 days of safety monitoring. 5 days. If I was to try and make up, literally, come up with the most sinister thing you can think of a vaccine, just make it up, I would never have dreamed of saying that. I would never have dreamed to say, yeah, you know, the FDA licensed a Hep B vaccine for babies with 5 days monitoring after the injection. Nobody would believe you because it sounds crazy. It is crazy, by the way. But there it is, black and white on the FDA website. And next slide, please. In fact, I'd love to I just want to, because it's so unbelievable, I'd like to just walk you through this for a second. Can you kindly click on the Google link? We're going to go to Google because that's, you know, Dr. Google knows everything. Can you kindly type in FDA licensed vaccines? Everybody can do this at home. Anybody ever questions you about the hepatitis B vaccine I just talked about, you can do this. Kindly click on the first link. We are now on the FDA website. Can you please scroll down to hepatitis B vaccines? Great. Stop right there, please. You can see there's 4 standalone shots. You can only give a standalone shot on the first day of life. Recombivac's HB, and then 3 other products. Only Recombivac's HB and Engerix B, by the way, are licensed for first day of life. The other 2 are only 18 and older. We'll take a look at Recombivac's HB, but before we do that, by the way, just, you know, Engerix B was only safety monitored for 4 days. So let's look at the longer period, you know. Can you kindly click on hepatitis B for Recombivac's HB? Excellent. Thank you. Scroll down, please. Can you click on the package insert, please? Voila. And zoom in just a little bit, make it bigger so folks can see it. Now scroll down a little more to the table of contents. There we go, section 6.1, adverse reactions, clinical trial experience. Can you kindly scroll down to section 6.1? Perfect. And that is all of the text in section 6.1 other than some of the reactions. And you can see right there it is, in 3 clinical studies, 434 doses, what we just read before. So there it is, on the FDA website. Last I checked, not an organization that is opposed to vaccines. When we saw this years ago, it seems so unbelievable. We, on behalf of the ICANN Vaccine Action Network, which is a nonprofit that we regularly represent in vaccine policy matters and supports our work, we FOIA'd the FDA for the clinical trial reports used to license this product. And when we finally got those reports, including requiring a lot of legal work and a lot of action on our part, it confirms it was 5 days of safety monitoring. And then we actually formally petitioned the FDA to withdraw this product until a proper clinical trial was conducted. That petition was done in the same formal manner that Moderna, Pfizer, and other pharmaceutical companies used to license vaccines. And the FDA was required to respond in 6 months. It's been over a year. they keep providing excuses because they don't have anything else to support the licensure of this product. There is no way you can say this product was safe and effective when it was licensed, which is the standard they must support, that they must hit. We're going to get to the question of how the FDA could do this, I promise. I know people must be thinking that. We're going to get there. Can we go back to the slide presentation, please? Thank you. My only point is I really just want to drive home how drugs are treated and how planes are treated and how vaccines are treated because of the lack of market force. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is a little excerpt from a deposition that I took of a doctor named Dr. Stanley Plotkin. He is really the godfather of modern vaccinology. The textbook for medical textbook for vaccines is called Plotkin's Vaccines. At the CDC, the vaccine committee, the gavel there is the Plotkin gavel. He's invented like 6 vaccines. And in a deposition that I had the opportunity to have with him, I went through this with him with regards to Recombavax HB and how, it's something's isn't it problematic that you can only assess causation with a proper clinical trial, but then you let these vaccines get licensed without a proper clinical trial? Isn't that problematic? Please play the video.
Dr. Plotkin, earlier you testified that there are 2 Hep B vaccines in the market, one by Glaxo GSK, that's Engerix B, and the other one is by Merck, Recombavax HB, right?
Yes.
Okay. This is the product, the manufacturer insert for Recombavax HB, correct?
Yes.
And the clinical trial experience would be found in section 6.1, correct?
Yes.
Okay. In section 6.1, when you look at the clinical trials that were done pre-licensure for Recombavax HB, how long does it say that safety was monitored after each dose?
5 days.
Okay. Is 5 days long enough to detect an autoimmune issue that arises after 5 days?
No.
Is 5 days long enough to detect any neurological disorder that arose from the vaccine after 5 days?
No.
There is no control group, correct?
It does not mention any control group, no.
No. If you turn to section 6.2, under immune system disorders, does it say that there were reports of hypersensitive reactions, including anaphylactoid reactions, bronchospasms, and urticaria having been reported within the first few hours after vaccination?
Yes.
Have there been reports of hypersensitivity syndrome?
Yes, that's what it states.
Reports of arthritis?
It is mentioned.
Okay. It also reports autoimmune diseases, including systemic lupus, erythematosus, lupus-like syndrome, vasculitis. There have been reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome, correct?
Yes.
As well as multiple sclerosis, exacerbation of multiple sclerosis, myelitis, including transverse myelitis, seizure, febrile seizure, peripheral neuropathy, including Bell's palsy, muscle weakness, hypothesia, and encephalitis, correct?
Correct.
Okay. But these are events that are reported after vaccination, and as we've just discussed, in order to establish whether it's causal between the vaccine and the condition, you need a randomized, placebo-controlled study. But
Yes.
that was not done for this hepatitis B vaccine before licensure, was it?
No.
Okay. And given that the vaccine now appears on the CDC's recommended list, isn't it true that it would now be considered unethical to conduct such a study today?
It would be, yes, it would be ethically difficult.
That problem that is repeated with vaccine after vaccine after vaccine. It's become the norm, and it's what you saw effectively with COVID-19 vaccine. You got a guaranteed market when it comes to childhood vaccines, just like COVID vaccines. Add no liability, and this is what you get. 1986, you could see what the CDC childhood schedule was. That is the childhood schedule in 2023. To really drive this home, next slide, please. Those two are interlaced with each other. So you could see all the red are the vaccines that are currently given. And you can see the time period to children on the CDC childhood schedule. The Green ones were the ones that were given in 1986 before pharmaceutical companies had immunity, when they actually had to pay for damages, harms from their vaccine products. Next slide, please. So what has that done? What it's done is it's taken vaccines as a percentage of the revenue portfolio of pharmaceutical companies from a very small percentage in 86 to a very significant percentage, depending on the pharmaceutical company, over time. That has generated a few $billion, what I call kitty, for the pharmaceutical companies to do what they are supposed to do, what every company does: promote their product. Car companies advertise to you that their cars are great all day long with all kinds of snazzy ads. Pharmaceutical companies just use indirect messengers to do the same thing. When you see an issue, by the way, with a car, how do you normally see? When does the news finally report an issue with a car? It's usually when there's a class action lawsuit, right? Yeah, you never see that with a vaccine, though. Right? You see it with drugs. You're not seeing it with the vaccine because you can't bring those suits. Pharmaceutical industry has taken those few $1 billion and they spread that money around very efficiently to medical journals, medical associations, medical schools, public relations firms, news advertising, lobbyists. There is, all kinds of books and all kinds of peer-reviewed studies that document all this. You need not take my word for it. And it has all of these professionals and intermediaries that are viewed as reliable authorities, essentially repeating the same mantra over and over again. Everybody may have heard this phrase before. It's 3 little words. That's right, safe and effective. Safe and effective, right? You hear it over and over. Some people think it's from God, by the way. That's how often you hear safe and effective. I'm not sure the organizations that really parrot this mantra ever really look that far into the substance. But that is, significant. That is part of what the pharmaceutical industry has been able to do, because they've just basically have nobody pushing back on them. They take their money and they make sure their product is well received and well regarded. Next slide, please. Okay, so we looked at the pre-licensure safety issues, and we looked at the money that they've been able to use to influence various organizations. Some have said to me, okay, fine. Well, look, maybe before it was licensed, they didn't do the proper studies. But, the CDC tells us all the time that they really rigorously study vaccine safety. We need not worry at all. They are sure COVID-19 vaccines are safe, just like they're sure every other vaccine is safe. Worry not. We study them. Now, let's use an example to look at the post-licensure safety studies, right? Because you're not assessing the safety before it's licensed. We just saw the hepatitis B vaccine. After it's licensed, what is the injury that the CDC, FDA, and all NIH have claimed that they have studied more than any other alleged injury from any vaccine? They say vaccines do not cause autism. That's right. They say that. Okay. If it's true that, in fact, they haven't really studied whether vaccines cause autism, and that's the injury they claim they've studied the most, then it really will cast doubt on whether they studied the 100 other serious injuries that parents routinely claim vaccines cause injury, right? So we're going to use autism as the litmus test for what does the post-licensure safety literature look like, right? I can tell you we have 9 professionals at our firm that just do vaccine injury work. 3 of them are medical professionals, lawyers, paralegals. You can sue for vaccine injury. You just sue the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. You sue the federal government. Same people tell you the vaccine's safe, by the way. And in those, we have to, when we get a call, we try to look into. My kid got a Hep B shot within 15 minutes, started seizing. Within 20 minutes, rushed to the emergency room, had a grand mal seizure, and then ended up with some kind of seizure disorder, blah, 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 some other issue. And we then would say, okay, usually we want to look at the clinical trial literature, clinical trial studies, use to license it. That's pointless. Then we look at the post-licensing safety literature, okay? And I'm going to use autism as the example. Now, let me make clear. I'm not saying vaccines cause autism. What I am saying is that if our federal health authorities claim it doesn't, they definitely should have the studies, I think, right? Next slide, please. In that regard, we did something very simple. We sent a Freedom of Information Act, again, on behalf of my client, Informed Consent Action Network, ICANN, asking the CDC to produce the following. All studies relied upon by CDC to claim that DTaP vaccine does not cause autism. DTaP is given 2 2, 4, and 6 months of life, 3 times first 6 months of life. Same thing for Engerix B and Recombinix HB. Remember those two? That's the Hep B vaccine we just looked at. Again, given 3 times in the first 6 months of life. Prevnar 13, HIV vaccine, IPV, as well as whether the cumulative effect of these vaccines cause autism. Simple request. This is the most thoroughly studied issue when it comes to vaccine safety in the history of the world, apparently. That's what I've been led to believe. So you would think that the CDC would have endless studies to support that these vaccines don't cause autism. After all, these are all the vaccines injected in the first 6 months of life into children. They are indeed vaccines. And if you're claiming vaccines don't cause autism, you should have studies to show that these vaccines don't cause autism, because we also know that autism can be diagnosed before, within the first year of life. Well, they did not provide a list of studies, and we finally had to sue them in federal court. What you're looking at right here is actually a order signed by a federal judge after a federal lawsuit we had to bring against CDC demanding those studies for those 5 vaccines. The CDC finally provided a list of 20 studies, and you can see them listed in that order, in this court order right there. You can just take a look on the right side. You can see I signed on behalf of ICANN. You can see the Department of Justice signed on behalf of the CDC, and you can see at the bottom right there on the 3rd page, that's a federal judge signing it as a binding order of a federal court. Here's the thing about those 20 studies they provided. They have words that make sentences, and we could read them. So we did. And when you read the studies, okay, here's the crazy thing about it. Not one of them provides a single study that supports that the vaccines we asked about do not cause autism. 18 of those studies involved thimerosal, which is an ingredient that is not in any of the vaccines we asked about, or an MMR vaccine, which is not given in the first year of life. One other study involved antigen exposure, not vaccine exposure, and that study explicitly states it cannot prove one way or another whether vaccines cause autism or not, because they're not studying vaccines. Finally, there was one last study. It was actually a review by the Institute of Medicine that involved MMR, not a vaccine we asked about, thimerosal, not an ingredient in the vaccines we asked about, but the DTaP vaccine. Finally, there's a review of at least one of the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life. All right. So again, we used that little skill we learned in 3rd grade, 1st grade, kindergarten, and we opened and we took a look at it. Next slide, please. So what did it say about DTaP vaccine? Well, here it is. Here's the Institute of Medicine review. Its conclusion. It says the evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between diphtheria tox or tetanus tox or cellular pertussis-containing vaccine and autism. We don't know. And when you actually look at the summary above, it does not identify a single study to show that DTaP vaccine does not cause autism. Remember, this is a survey by the Institute of Medicine looking at all the medical literature, trying to answer the question of, does DTaP vaccine cause autism or not? Commissioned by our federal health authorities, okay? And why did they look at this? Because DTaP, autism remained one of the most commonly claimed injuries from the DTaP vaccine, which is why our federal health authorities commissioned the Institute of Medicine to review that question. If you look closely at this summary, there actually is one study they did identify. Right there, it says Geyer and Geyer, 2004. Guess what? That study actually did find a correlation between autism and DTaP. But the Institute of Medicine threw the study out. You know why? It said it's unreliable because it relies on VAERS data. Irony, isn't it? We'll get into VAERS later. Just to recap that very quickly, we formally asked our federal health authorities for the studies using the mechanism Congress provided for members of the public to get answers out of our government, right? Federal government and those employed in those agencies, we pay the bill. I'm not sure they remember that. We pay the bill. They work for the public. When somebody works for you, you got to have a way to check up on them. And Congress, the way that they designed was the Freedom of Information Act. That's how you get. That is the legal way to demand answers, to demand documents out of the federal government. We use that mechanism. We asked for the studies they relied upon to claim that vaccines don't cause autism for all the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life. They did not have a single study to produce. Here's the worst part, okay? That's not bad enough. And again, I use that as an example for all the other injuries that are claimed from vaccines, just like you see with COVID vaccine. What the science probably looks like out there. I'll tell you from our work, it's vacuous. It's almost non-existent for the most part. There isn't these robust studies that they do to assure vaccine safety. Not before licensure, not after licensure. Again, we'll get into why it's like that, but a big part of it's the market forces. Here's the thing, and you've seen this with COVID vaccine, and this is the part that frankly is the most troubling, is that when there is no evidence, like you just saw with autism, they as in federal health authorities, they use the lack of evidence to claim it doesn't cause it. I'm going to say that again. Vaccinologists, and I've deposed many of them. You just saw me depose one. You're going to see another clip of that deposition in about a second. I've deposed vaccinologists, immunologists, infectious disease experts, pediatricians, part of what I do for my job. And I will say that I encounter this over and over again. They use in vaccinology. I don't think they do this in other areas of science because it's nonsensical. But in vaccinology, the lack of evidence is used as a base to say there does not cause the issue. It should be used to say we don't know, but it's not. Kids might call that lying. I won't use that term, but kids might call that lying. Just to drive this home, here's the childhood vaccine schedule. The one in yellow is the one vaccine they studied for autism, MMR. And those are some of the vaccine ingredients, and that's the one ingredient they studied. Just to bring home, when they say vaccines don't cause autism, this is what they did. Kindly hit play.
It is my great honor to use the Stanley Plotkin gavel to open this meeting.
As our good friend and colleague, Dr. Stan Plotkin.
Dr. Plotkin. Virtually every country in the world is affected by his vaccines.
He was involved in pivotal trials on anthrax, oral polio, rabies vaccine,
the rubella vaccine, the rotavirus vaccine, rabies.
He has earned the Distinguished Physician Award of the Pediatric Infectious Disease Society, the Finland Award of the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases, the Hilleman Award of the American Society for Microbiology, the French Legion of Honor, and the Bruce Medal in Preventive Medicine.
He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and the French Academy of Medicine.
One of the very special things about him is the global impact that he's had, not just from the products, but from his book.
He developed the standard textbook for vaccines in 1988.
Bill Gates calls his book a Bible for vaccinologists.
I hope you all have indeed read the book. And I hope it's more accurate than the Bible.
He trained just a generation of scientists, including myself, to think like he thinks.
This is an excerpt from the IOM's report, right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you read the causality conclusion with regard to whether DTaP and Tdap cause autism?
The evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between diphtheria toxoid, tetanus toxoid, or acellular pertussis containing vaccine and autism.
If you don't know whether DTaP or Tdap cause autism, shouldn't you wait until you do know, until you have the science to support it, to then say that vaccines do not cause autism?
Do I wait? No, I do not wait, because I have to take into account the health of the child.
And so for that reason, you're okay with telling the parent that DTaP, Tdap does not cause autism, even though the science isn't there yet to support that claim?
Absolutely.
Let that sink in for a moment. Think about that. Really. I mean, it can be funny, but it's serious. I mean, you've seen the same exact thing with COVID-19 vaccines. They use the absence of evidence to claim nothing to see here, to tell you it does not cause that injury. There is study after study after study that surveys parents across this country with kids with autism, and they will tell you, a significant proportion, majority in those studies often will tell you that it's vaccines, and they don't point to just MMR, they point to all kinds of vaccines, often Prevnar vaccine, DTaP vaccine, and they say that they believe that's what's caused their child's autism. When do we stop listening to parents? When do we stop listening to mothers? We stop listening to them when we let the market forces disappear and we let vaccinologists and statistics take over how we treat these people rather than actually listening to the individual people who are telling you what harmed them. Okay, so that's all I have on the market forces bit. There's a lot more to say, but I hope that drives it home. What happens when you eliminate the most important safety check on a corporation that is powerful, makes billions a year, has incredible reach? Pharmaceutical companies have 1,400 lobbyists. I'm not aware of a single vaccine safety lobbyist in Congress. Okay, I'm not aware of any. There's, they can go out, they can pretty much do what they want, and they do not have to worry about class action lawyers or product liability attorneys because they have been neutered. Cannot go after them for the most part for any of their vaccines. And that is an environment in which COVID-19 vaccines fell into on the market regulation front. They're used to having the run of the mill. So let's now talk about the second way we assure product safety. The far weaker and less effective way. No knock on the government, far less effective way, which is regulators. Next slide, please. So I actually had the opportunity to depose Dr. Catherine Edwards. You saw the vaccine book right there. It's on the screen. This is the formal medical textbook. She's one of the 4 editors. She's one of the leading vaccinologists in the country. She actually is one of the head of one of the 4 safety systems for vaccines in America that CDC runs called CISA. She is probably one of the top 3 vaccinologists in the country. Some call her the godmother of vaccinology. This is a case involving vaccines and autism, and I had an opportunity to depose her, and you can hear what she has to say about the state of the science regarding vaccines and autism. Please hit play.
According to your profile, you have done most of the pivotal trials relied upon to license many of the vaccines, correct, on the market?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you're highly experienced at conducting clinical trials, correct?
I'm highly experienced conducting clinical trials.
Okay. And you're familiar with many of the clinical trials that relied upon to license many of the vaccines currently on the market, correct?
I am.
In your opinion, did the clinical trials relied upon to license the vaccines that Yates received, many of which are still on the market today, were they designed to rule out that the vaccine causes autism?
No. You've badgered me into answering the question the way you want me to, but I think that that's probably the answer.
Is that your accurate and truthful testimony?
Yes.
In the expert disclosures for this case, it asserts that, among other things, you will testify that, quote, the issue of whether vaccines cause autism has been thoroughly researched and rejected, end quote. It's your testimony that MMR vaccine cannot cause autism.
That's correct.
It's your testimony that Hep B vaccine cannot cause autism.
That's correct.
It's your testimony that IPOL cannot cause autism.
Yes.
It's your testimony that HIB vaccine cannot cause autism.
Yes.
It's your testimony that varicella vaccine cannot cause autism.
Yes.
It's your testimony that Prevnar vaccine cannot cause autism.
Yes.
And it's your testimony that DTaP vaccine cannot cause autism.
Yes.
And do you have a study that supports that DTaP doesn't cause autism?
I do not have a study that DTaP caused autism. So I don't have either.
Do you have any study one way or another of whether IPOL causes autism?
No, I do not, sir.
Do you have any study one way or another of whether NGRX B causes autism?
I do not have any evidence that it causes autism, nor that it does not.
And what about HIB titers vaccine? Any evidence one way or another of whether it causes autism?
No.
What about Prevnar vaccine? Any evidence one way or another?
No, sir. No, sir.
And how about varicella vaccine? Let me just finish. Are there any studies one way or another that support whether it does or doesn't cause autism?
Part of MMR, but not as varicella by itself. No, sir. No studies that say it does, or no studies that say it doesn't.
Right. Um, I- there have been studies that have found an association between hepatitis B vaccine and autism, correct?
Not studies that I feel are credible.
Okay, which study are you referring to when you say that?
Well, why don't you show me the study and then I'll see whether I agree with it.
The point is that parents claim all kinds of issues and injuries from various vaccines. Most of them, by the way, are immune issues or immune-mediated neurological disorders. I could tell you that chronic health issues among children, according to public health authorities, went in 1986 from around 12% to around 50% today. Most of those are immune-mediated neurological issues. I'm not saying vaccines caused all those that rise in injuries. I'm saying that you should probably start and study a product given to babies over and over again to modify their immune system, as maybe rule that out first before you say that you don't have any concerns with those products in terms of safety. So that is on the market force side. Let's move on to the regulators. Next slide, please. Congress, when it eliminated the market forces, recognized that it left a vacuum with regards to assuring the safety of these products. And so what it did was it put the federal health authorities, the Department of Health and Human Services, that is the department of our federal government under which CDC, NIH, FDA all exist, and made the Secretary of HHS responsible for vaccine safety. Thank you. You can see it on that chart right there. Next slide, please. The 1986 Act actually has a section called the Mandate for Safer Childhood Vaccines. This section is literally the section that underpins all of vaccine safety in our country. Okay, this is the section of law that mandated the Secretary of HHS, which stepped into the shoes of the pharmaceutical companies to assure that vaccines are safe. And it's a very simple section. It's got 3 parts. The third part, we'll start at the bottom. Section C requires that every 2 years, the Secretary of HHS inform Congress and provide a report how it made vaccines safer. Simple enough. Simply creating a report. Well, we FOIA'd for those reports next, and you could see they advised us they've never submitted that report once to Congress. Never. Not one time. That's the easy part, by the way, of making vaccines safer. Okay? Just tell Congress every 2 years what you did to make it safer. Then let's look at the next part going up the list, Section B. Section B is a task force comprised of the head of the FDA, CDC, and NIH that's supposed to make recommendations to the Secretary of HHS how to make vaccines safer. Yeah? Well, we FOIA'd for all those recommendations. The response we got, they disbanded the committee in 1998. The first part of this mandate for safer childhood vaccines actually provides, when you read it, that the Secretary of HHS shall make and assure improvements in, otherwise use the Secretary with respect to the licensure, manufacturing, goes through every possible aspect of vaccine manufacturing, marketing, and so forth, in order to reduce the risk of adverse reactions to vaccines. Meaning it made the Secretary of HHS responsible for vaccine safety. If the Secretary of HHS is not doing the easy parts, just submitting a biannual report to Congress, and doesn't even bother to keep a task force to make recommendations, you think the Secretary is doing the hard part? And we just saw what some of the vaccine safety science looks like pre and post licensure. I'll let you judge whether you think he's doing his job. Next slide, please. Now, you might say, well, why? Why did HHS abandon its vaccine safety duties? I believe most people who go into public health are good intention. They mean well. They want to help people. The problem is that HHS is hopelessly conflicted. Congress made HHS, again, which includes CDC, NIH, FDA, and so forth, not only responsible for vaccine safety, they've also made them responsible for promoting vaccines. And when an agency is responsible for both promoting and safety, they come into conflict. And one of them wins out. And here, promotion function won out. For example, when it comes to transportation in America, there's a Department of Transportation. They're responsible for promoting more air travel, more airplanes in the sky. Well, you got government officials glab-handing with industry saying, hey, get more planes in the sky. Do more, we want more transportation in America. It's hard to, at the same time, shake somebody's hand and slap them for safety issues. So Congress created a completely separate agency, independent of the Department of Transportation, called the National Transportation Safety Board. Completely independent. Similarly, nuclear power plants. The Department of Energy promotes nuclear power plants in America. they try to get more built. It's hard to try to make more built and slapping them at the same time for safety. So they created a completely separate agency called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But when it comes to vaccines, there's no separation. HHS is responsible for the promotion and the safety function. And the promotion function has won out within those agencies. Second reason they've abandoned is because not only is HHS responsible for promotion of vaccines, as I mentioned earlier, you can sue for a vaccine injury in America. You just don't sue the pharmaceutical companies. You sue the Secretary of the Department of HHS. You can see it on your screen under number 2. That is the quote. And we have an example there of a petition you file in the Federal Court of Claims. You file in the Federal Court of Claims in Washington, D.C., because that's the only court in America typically you can sue the federal government for money. Okay, so you are suing the very same federal health authorities that are telling you vaccines are safe. Think about that. And they're represented, by the way, by a little law firm. You might have heard of them, called the Department of Justice. They have some of our money. And they vigorously fight these claims because they have to. That's their duty under the law. And when you go and you file these claims, by the way, you don't even get an Article 3 judgment. Article 3 of the Constitution, you get a special master. You have no discovery, pretty much as of right. We can't depose pharmaceutical companies. We can't take depositions. We can't do any of the things we normally do in a lawsuit. We have our hand ties behind our back, but we're supposed to provide years of our records to the DOJ so they could hire, with our money, all kinds of experts to try and pick them apart. The important point is this. HHS is responsible for defending against any claim of vaccine injury in court. If they do a study that shows that vaccines are responsible for 3% of this serious issue, what will lawyers like my firm and a few the other firms that do vaccine injury claims, this program, we will use it as an admission against interest. We will use it against the federal health authorities to establish liability. That is an incredible conflict that should not exist. But it does. There it is. And you can read it in black and white right there on the screen, and you have the citation to the law. Finally, there is a revolving door between the federal health authorities and pharmaceutical companies. If you look at all the labs, the former heads of the FDA and HHS, and where do they go work afterwards? Right, they usually go to work at pharmaceutical companies making a lot of money. So the leadership in these agencies are, they know if they don't behave and they don't toe the line, they're not getting that lucrative job when they go out of government positions. It's a real big problem. We've actually tried to work with members of Congress to pass, to try to get legislation adopted that would prohibit the public officials that work for us, get paid by us, to then go and work for pharmaceutical companies against our interests when they leave government. That hasn't gotten much traction. 1,400 lobbyists versus 0. Maybe that has something to do with it in terms of pharmaceutical lobbyists. And what this has done over the last 37 years, because this has been going on since 1987, it's turned the federal health authorities, they don't view themselves as regulators. They really view themselves as partners with industry to get these products out there. And I think when you look at COVID vaccines, you really see that in action. I'm going to go through a few examples in a minute. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through a few more pieces regarding the bigger picture, and then I'm going to move on and talk specifically about COVID-19 vaccines. So here, by the way, is in terms of the incestuous relationship between pharmaceutical companies and the federal health authorities, you don't need to take my word for it. Here is a congressional report from 2000 that specifically looked at the FDA and the CDC's vaccine committees. And look what they concluded. Quote, the overwhelming majority of members, both voting members and consultants, have substantial ties to the pharmaceutical industry, end quote. They're talking about VRBPAC. That is the FDA advisory committee that effectively decides on whether to license a vaccine. You've seen them in the news regarding COVID vaccines. This is in 2000, when most vaccines on the childhood schedule were already on there. Again, I didn't say this. This congressional report said this. Next button, please. You would think they'd clean up their act, right? It's kind of an embarrassing report. You should read that congressional report. It is extremely embarrassing. Nope. Here's a 2009 report by the HHS Inspector General, again finding the same conflicts persisted. They didn't clean up their act. And in fact, do you remember, you would think that after 2009, finally, they clean up their act. Congress is harpooning them. Their own Inspector General is writing reports just showing, they're embarrassing reports. You think they'd care? Well, I can tell you now much has changed, and I'll use an example to show that. Many people in the stream have already seen it clearly with COVID-19 vaccines, and I'm going to use the example in the following way. Dr. Catherine Edwards, who you saw me depose a minute ago, right? You saw that little clip. She was also the vaccinologist on the 5-member independent data safety monitoring board for the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. She is the person who was responsible when the COVID-19 vaccine Pfizer was going through its clinical trials for assuring the safety while the trial was ongoing. Well, I had an opportunity to ask her a few questions to see, is she really independent? When I had her on the stand, and this time it was in trial, what you saw was in a deposition. This was when I was cross-examining her on the stand in front of a jury. Next slide, please.
Isn't it true that you've also been an advisor to Pfizer?
Yes, sir. I have been an advisor to Pfizer, and I've been working very, very closely with Pfizer, particularly their COVID vaccines, and going over lots of reactions and adverse events. So yes, I am working and being paid by Pfizer for my assessment of vaccine safety.
You're part of the data safety monitoring board for the
That's
Pfizer
correct.
COVID vaccine. Is that what you meant when you
That
said
is
that?
correct.
You're one of the only 5 members of that data safety monitoring board over the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, right?
Yes, sir, I am.
And that's supposed to be an independent data safety monitoring board, correct?
It is an independent data safety and monitoring board.
That's the board that all of us in America are hoping on and relying upon is going to independently make sure that safety is properly assessed as the clinical trial for that Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine is ongoing, correct?
That's true, and let me tell you that we have worked very hard to go over this and worked very, very hard to do that indeed as comprehensively as we possibly can.
And since it's supposed to be independent, it's critical that the members of that independent data safety monitoring board are in fact independent of the pharmaceutical company whose product is being evaluated, correct?
That's correct.
But isn't it true that directly before becoming a member of the independent data safety monitoring board of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, you were an advisor to Pfizer?
Pfizer pays me to evaluate the safety of their vaccines because I'm an expert. So I do get paid to do the work that I've been doing, but I've been doing the work conscientiously and comprehensively.
My question was, before you became a member of the independent data safety monitoring board for the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, isn't it true that you were separately, before you held that independent position, you were an advisor to Pfizer?
Yes, sir, but I think what you're presuming is that because I've been an advisor makes me on their dole or makes me going to say what they want me to say. That is not and has never been a part of my being. I say what I believe based on my expertise.
So you don't think that financial incentives can sway people's judgment at all?
It does not sway my judgment, sir.
Why bother having an independent data safety monitoring board? Why doesn't Pfizer just have some of its employees on it?
Because we are independent.
Meaning folks who were never advisors to Pfizer.
We are independent from Pfizer in this assessment.
I don't think I need to say anything. So there it is. But she believes it. Understand. The folks in the federal health authorities, these vaccinologists, she runs one of CDC's 4 safety systems for vaccines in this country. This is what I said earlier. They really view themselves as partners with this industry. And that is something that didn't happen with COVID-19 vaccines. It happened over a 37-year period in which there has been no check on vaccines. There's no moneyed interest, if you will, pushing back on pharmaceutical companies. For all of those years, they get to do what they want, they get to influence who they want, and the normal market force check, class action, and product liability attorneys been cut out of the mix, and the regulatory agencies, because of the way the 1986 Act was structured, are hopelessly conflicted. Okay, let's move on to COVID-19 vaccines. With that paradigm in place, okay, that backdrop, let's specifically look at COVID-19 vaccines. And hopefully things will make more sense now when I talk about COVID-19 vaccines. Because honestly, I think without understanding that backdrop, it's harder to understand how federal health authorities, how how folks who've been injured by COVID-19 can be treated the way they've been treated, and how COVID vaccines can be treated the way they were. Next slide, please. So, with COVID-19 vaccines, you got the same exact problem. There's no market forces that assure the safety of this product. Why? You can't sue Pfizer or Moderna or J&J for injuries from their COVID-19 vaccine. And the only reason I bring up the safety and efficacy of vaccines is not to take issue with the safety and efficacy of vaccines. They're just a product. There are statins, heart medicines. They have safety and efficacy profiles as well. I'm not talking about those today because nobody mandates you to take heart medicine. Nobody mandates you to take other products. When the moment that they coerce and mandate you to take a vaccine, they make the question of the safety and efficacy of those products no longer just a medical issue. They make it a civil and individual rights issue. So I'm not talking about this from a medical perspective. I'm talking about the safety and efficacy from a civil and individual rights perspective. Just to be very clear, everybody should be free to get as many vaccines as they want, wear as many masks as they want, hide out in their basement forever if they want, because that's America, that's freedom. But nobody should be coerced to do that. Okay, so moving on to COVID-19 vaccines. Taking the backdrop of what's been happening over the last 37 years, and let's apply it to COVID-19 vaccines. Just like with other vaccines, the 1986 Act, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, also applies to COVID-19 vaccines once it was added to the childhood schedule, and so you can't sue for injuries from COVID-19 vaccines. There is actually an additional layer of protection for COVID-19 vaccines that doesn't exist for other vaccines. Not that it, frankly, makes much of a difference because pharmaceutical companies are immune anyway. But it's a little bit even more pernicious, so I think it might be worth pointing out that when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, not only do they have the 86 Act protection, they also have something called PrEP Act immunity. Okay, that is an immunity that is given by a declaration from the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services that says that basically you can't sue for injuries, or not only injury issues, but efficacy issues from products developed to respond to what the Secretary says is an emergency, in this case COVID, which would include COVID-19 vaccines. And so under the PrEP Act, not only can you not sue for safety and efficacy issues, it actually makes it, which is that you can't even sue for willful misconduct. That if there's willful misconduct, you can't just go bring a lawsuit against Pfizer or Moderna. If somebody walked into this room here today and presented us with clear, convincing evidence of those executives, pharmaceutical executives, talking to each other, plotting, scheming, clearly committing, intentional misconduct, the HHS itself would have to first bring an action against those pharmaceutical companies before you can even bring a claim, a civil attorney like myself. And the odds of the federal government, after they told you this product's safe and effective and convinced 270 million Americans to go and get it, the odds of them admitting there's an issue are kind of low. So anyway, the more important point is market forces also gone for COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide, please. And by the way, not only market forces gone, the federal government, when they purchased COVID-19 vaccines, contractually agreed and assured Pfizer and Moderna that they would have PrEP Act immunity for the use of their products, which is something I've never even seen before. The whole idea of PrEP Act immunity is that if there's a reason to have it, it shouldn't exist because of a contractual pre-guarantee by our federal government. Again, just emblematic of the way our federal government views their relationship with these pharmaceutical companies, that they would contractually agree for a product that hadn't even been developed yet, not even created yet. Don't worry, we assure you, nobody can ever sue you, not only under the 86 Act, but the PrEP Act as well. So that's market forces on COVID-19 vaccines. Let's move on to the regulators. Okay, let's start with the FDA. This is the FDA homepage. Does this look like a regulator to you? What does this look like? Looks like a marketing ad. What is the FDA's job? To assure the product is safe and effective to its standard, and let's just put that issue aside, to its standard before it is, right, put on the market. What product is it advertising on its homepage? The bivalent. Is that licensed? Oh, they're advertising an unlicensed vaccine. You think the FDA, I mean, it's only been authorized, only emergency use authorized. It hasn't been found to be safe and effective to the FDA standard such that it could be licensed yet. Do you think the FDA, after telling 270 million Americans, go get this shot, advertising it like this? Next slide, please. Dr. Peter Marks, who's the head of the vaccine division of the FDA, doing cutesy videos on YouTube telling you, just a minute, and giving you, basically trying to convince you to vaccinate you and your kids, again, for an unlicensed vaccine. When it finally comes time for the FDA to actually evaluate the clinical trial data, in which Dr. Catherine Edwards, independently, by the way, oversaw that it was safe while it was going on, do you think the FDA is in a position to truly independently and objectively evaluate the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine to determine whether to license it? After telling everybody to get it, advertising on his homepage, putting out these YouTube videos, and go, maybe, after looking at it, if they find an issue, go, oops, sorry, you remember we told you to get that shot? It's kind of a problem. No. That just creates a real problem. The FDA does not stay in its lane, so to speak. It should be a cold, hard, independent regulatory agency that clinically looks at the data, decide whether it's safe and effective to its standard, nothing more, but instead it views itself as a partner with industry and goes out and promotes these products even before it's licensed. Just want you to really think about that for a minute. It's normalized. If you saw the Atomic Nuclear Agency responsible for the safety of nuclear power plants doing something like this, people would freak out. Next slide, please. Another example of the FDA not doing its job. We asked the FDA, after it took 108 days to license the COVID-19 vaccine for Pfizer, to also release all the data it relied upon to license that shot. The FDA refused. We had to sue them in federal court. They took the position that they're only going to produce 500 pages a day, which would have taken at least 75 years, probably longer. And, as some of you might know, the federal judge, in an excellent decision, agreed that no, that's not going to accord with the purposes of the Freedom of Information Act and ensure transparency, and ordered that it produce that 55,000 pages a month. The FDA had to be ordered by a federal judge, by a separate branch of government, to timely just produce information, just the data it relied upon to license the COVID-19 vaccine. Next slide, please. And you would think, by the way, the FDA would learn its lesson, because when we went and we asked for the Moderna data, the data that the FDA relied upon to license the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine for 12 to 15-year-olds, that they'd produce that in a timely manner. In a lawsuit we brought on behalf of a doctors group as well as the DeGarry family, which I'll tell you about in a second. The FDA again took the position that they wanted decades to produce that data. And this is a decision actually from the court we just got about a week or two ago, and the judge decided no, you got to produce it all within 24 months, which is about, on average, about over 180,000 pages. I'm hoping the FDA is starting to get the message, but I'm not sure they are, because they have all our money, and they view themselves as antagonistic to the population. They view themselves as partners with the industry. It is the only product where the federal government, instead of actually siding with consumers and protecting consumers, sides with the companies to defend against any claims made by consumers that the product causes injuries we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So two more examples of the FDA and how it conducts itself with regards to COVID-19 vaccines. Maddie DeGarry was only one of 1,131 children in the Pfizer clinical trial for 12 to 15-year-olds. I bring her up because she was also a plaintiff. Her parents were a plaintiff in that lawsuit I just told you about, seeking the Pfizer data for 12 to 15-year-olds. Young Maddie was dancing in TikTok videos, as you could see, before she got the COVID shot. And within 24 hours of getting her second dose, next slide, please, she was in the emergency room and slowly descended a cascade of health issues that landed her in a wheelchair to this day and a feeding tube. The fact that the COVID-19 vaccine caused her to suffer these incredible harms, is tragic. But drugs, vaccines, can cause harm. That happens. What's really problematic is that when Pfizer reported that injury to the FDA, did not report that she was in a wheelchair and a feeding tube, but reported it as functional abdominal pain. Basically reported that she had a tummy ache. We sent letter after letter to the FDA with all of Mr. Gary's records, medical records, showing clearly, dozen emergency room visits, all the initial visits documenting that it was a reaction to the vaccine. And the FDA finally, by the way, after over 100 days, eventually responded to us. You know what they told the DeGary family? Told them to file a VAERS report. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Can't make this up. We FOIA'd then for the internal communications that the FDA had with Pfizer about Mr. Gary, and we finally got them, took a whole federal lawsuit to get them. And what you see is eventually, finally, the FDA demanded is too strong, asked Pfizer, can you please give us more information about, Maddie DeGary? Because, we're getting all these letters and so forth. And Pfizer submits a report to the FDA. In that report, it finally discloses all the harms that we just talked to you as far as from the records that we have seen. Now, on that basis alone, if I'm in the FDA, I'm going, whoa, wait a second. You told me functional abdominal pain. There's a whole lot more than that. Why didn't you tell me that to begin with? No, I didn't see any communications saying that. Instead, there's this report, and when you read it, the first time I read it, I was like, oh, wow, here it is. Pfizer's admitting their vaccine caused Maddie's injuries. And when you get to the very bottom of that narrative, then you have the Pfizer paid principal investigator say that he does not, quote unquote, feel, that's the word, doesn't feel that Maddie's injuries were related to the COVID-19 vaccine. And then if you, and these, read then the communications within the FDA. Dr. Peter Marks, remember Mr. Just a Minute, right? That's his communications, Mr. Just a Minute. He goes, great. Pfizer says they don't feel it's related to the vaccine. He sends that to the director of the FDA, and that's the end of the story from what we can tell from the documents we got. I don't feel that that's appropriate, by the way. I don't feel that was a good idea. I don't feel like that's good oversight. I don't feel that's what a regulator should do, but, if we make decisions based on how people feel, then they should immediately recognize autism and all the other injuries that the parents who are with these children are saying they feel cause their children's injuries. Her parents, who are in the best position to judge what happened to Mary, feel it's related to the vaccine. In fact, they have the medical records to show it, but that's not good enough. But if Pfizer paid principal investigation feels it's not related, then it's actually accepted. Just an incredible reality. I don't think that would exist with any other product that I'm aware of. Next slide, please. Let's look at one other thing with the FDA, and let's move on to CDC, and then we'll wrap this up. One other example of how it could be the FDA is acting the way it does. Let's look at the clinical trial that was conducted regarding the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. And what is the worst outcome that you're worried about from COVID and in the clinical trial? Death. And when you look at the FDA report of the number of deaths in the vaccine group, those who got the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, and those who got a placebo, and folks here might remember they vaccinated the whole placebo group after about 2 months of safety on average. So for the time period they had that data, and there were 21 deaths in the vaccinated group and 17 in the placebo group. I'm just a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure 21 is bigger than 17 by a lot. That's a pretty big differential. And when you do a clinical trial, the whole purpose of a clinical trial is a statistical comparison. It's a new product. You don't know how it affects the human body yet, which is why you're doing the clinical trial with a placebo. So what you do is you look at those who got it, those who got a placebo, and you compare the rates. It's a statistical comparison because you don't know exactly how the product affects the body. That's the point of a placebo-controlled clinical trial. So you can source that out statistically, blindly, without the influence and corrupting judgment of the company who's conducting the trial, right? When they looked at efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine, if you might recall, and they said it was 95% effective, putting aside how they got to those two data points of how many had a the 8 that had in the vaccinated group that they say, had COVID, and the 100 something in the unvaccinated in the placebo control. That was a statistical comparison. They just compared the numbers. But when it came to the deaths, when there was 21 deaths in the vaccine and 17 deaths in placebo, they decided to do something different. They decided to, quote unquote, assess each death to see if it's related potentially to the vaccine. And who did that assessment? No, not the FDA. Pfizer's paid investigators. Dr. Catherine Edwards and all the other folks, the same guy who didn't feel the principal investigator for Maddie DeGarry's situation, they're the ones who did that assessment and provides it to the FDA. If there were less vaccinated deaths in the vaccinated group and more deaths in the placebo group, you think they would have done that? I don't want to speculate. But they didn't when it was the wrong way. When it's the right way, then they accept the statistical comparison. So we actually wrote the FDA, and we said, hey, FDA, you're doing statistical comparisons for other stuff in this clinical trial. Why aren't you doing it for this death data? This is highly concerning. Because if you're going to allow the pharmaceutical company, the sponsors, paid investigators to basically exercise their judgment to determine whether the vaccine causes or doesn't cause, I was like, why do a clinical trial at all? What's the point? Next slide, please. So we wrote the FDA, and we asked, you can see up top, why are the death data from the randomized controlled trials treated like a clinical case series rather than a randomized clinical trial when it comes to assessing causality with regards to the death, question mark. And everything on these slides, by the way, has got links, so you can look these up yourself. And here's the FDA response. We're unable to respond substantively at this time due to resource constraints and the ongoing pandemic response, end quote. I thought that stopping deaths from the COVID vaccine was pretty important, but apparently it's not that important. I don't know what to say about that, but there it is. Black and white, you can read the FDA letter yourself. They just don't want to answer because they don't really have a good answer. That's the FDA in my view. That's my experience with the FDA when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines. So if you think the FDA is out there acting like a regulator, assuring the product is safe, really doing a proper safety and efficacy, you're ignoring what's really going on. Don't judge by what people say, judge by what they do. Look at what the FDA is doing. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the CDC. Okay, so with regards to the CDC, let's start with the VAERS data. Right? There's 2 safety systems that they really relied upon to say that COVID-19 vaccines are safe after they came on the market. One is VAERS and one was VSafe. The CDC put out a report with something called proportional reporting ratio. That is it's a statistical method that the CDC decided they were going to use to determine whether or not there were safety signals in the VAERS data. Okay? CDC came up with this ratio, and it's a long-standing methodology they have, before the COVID-19 vaccine was rolled out. So then they applied that preset method of determining whether there's a safety signal with the VAERS data. And I don't think they like what they found because they wouldn't release it to the public. It took legal action to get it. And you can see a sampling over there in the yellow column for some of the issues that are denoted in the first column. One would mean that there's, essentially no signal. 2 would mean that there's a significant signal. That's like 100% increased rate than expected. You could see here that there's 60, 70, 30, 40 times the rate that they expected for some of these issues. When we confronted the CDC and we said, aren't you highly concerned about these ratios that were the result of your own predetermined way to analyze VAERS data? They told us, no, don't worry. FDA did something called empirical Bayesian analysis, and they looked at the same VAERS data, and they concluded there's no issue. There's no signals. So we're good. Don't worry. Everything's fine. So we said, okay, fine. Then can we please have the empirical Bayesian analysis data? The FDA won't give it to us. We're actually in federal court in Washington, D.C. right now trying to get that data. They don't want to produce it. Wonder why? Well, guess what? We'll have to wait and see what that data shows when we finally do get it. Next slide, please. So that's the VAERS data, in my view, in a nutshell. They applied a statistical methodology. They found serious signals. when those signals came about, they decided to do a different methodology that they now want to hide from the public. All right, what about vSafe? Okay, this is the other safety system that they said that they used to assure the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. vSafe is the premier system that CDC relied upon to assure the COVID-19 vaccine were safe. It was specifically designed to review the safety of COVID-19 vaccines. It was rolled out in December of 2020 at the same exact time the first COVID-19 vaccine was rolled out in December of 2020. It wasn't like theirs. It wasn't there for you to just report an issue from a COVID-19 vaccine. It was there to sign up the day you got the shot and then submit a report daily for a week, and then every week for 6 weeks, and then at 12, 24, and 52 weeks. And it provided information as well. And most of the 10 million people that signed up for vSafe signed up in the first 5 months of the vaccine was rolled out. When everybody was enthusiastic, when people were mandated to get it, these are the folks who wanted the shot. Remember, this is the time when they were clamoring over each other to get the shot because you have to wait in line and have to be of a certain type to get the shot. So these 10 million people sign up for vSafe, almost like a patriotic duty. They want to participate in this exciting new vaccine, and they're filling out these surveys, okay? Here's the thing about the vSafe data. In some ways, it's definitely better than VAERS data, because VAERS, you don't have a denominator. It's from an unknown population size. So it's hard to determine the rate of harm. vSafe, we know there's 10 million users. So if 500,000 report myocarditis, that means we know that there's a 5% myocarditis rate. We get a rate, but you can't do VAERS. So in that way, it's way better than VAERS. Second, it collects data in a systemized manner that is the same for every user, just like a clinical trial. How do clinical trials collect data? They ask the participants questions and they record it. That's how they collect the data. How else are you going to get the data? That's what vSafe does. Ask the participants questions in a systematic way. The difference between vSafe data and clinical trial data, in the clinical trials are about 30,000 people for COVID-19 vaccines. Here you get 10 million. And there, the data is collected by the pharmaceutical company, filtered through them, given to the FDA, and then you got to fight in court because they want to hide it for 75 years to get it to the public. Here, the data is not filtered through a pharmaceutical company. Okay, it's just standardized data. As you can imagine, the CDC didn't want to just give it to us. We spent a year and a half in federal court fighting for that data. Let me show you what that data finally showed him. And I think you'll quickly see why the CDC fought so dang hard in federal court. Took 2 federal lawsuits until they finally capitulated and provided this check the box data in the vSafe system. Next slide, please. Let's start with what was collected. There are actually only 2 things collected. 2 check the box data types collected in vSafe. 1, symptoms. 2, what they call health impact. Next slide, please. Let's look at the symptoms. There's a list of about 10 symptoms, and if you could call it 13, 15, 14 because there's a number of sub ones that are in there. But when you look at these symptoms, okay, which were collected for only 1 week after the shot, they're the exact symptoms that the CDC tells you are totally normal to have after the shot. Because they call it reactogenicity. It means you have an immune response, which is good. It means they believe that the vaccine's working. They tell you these are the symptoms you should have. These are good to have after the shot. Don't take my word for it. Here's the director of the CDC Immunization Safety Office, Tom Shimabukuro, saying exactly much in a document, in an email that we had to FOIA. We came in one of our FOIA requests. We have over 1,000 FOIA requests to the CDC, FDA, and NIH on behalf of the Informed Consent Action Network, so we get a lot of their internal emails. And here he is admitting exactly that. When you look at this list, like, pain and, the symptoms that really just don't matter, and you look at it, you might quickly realize what's not on this list. What's not on this list are the issues that you actually would care about. How about myocarditis or pericarditis? Or at least, how about chest pain? Right? Or all the other issues that we are seeing with the COVID vaccine. At least if they were not there when they started the rollout of vSafe, why not add them? So you might say to yourself, well, Maybe the CDC didn't know the COVID-19 vaccine could cause transverse myelitis, blood clotting, all of these issues we're now aware of from the COVID-19 vaccine. Next slide, please. Yeah, they don't get that pass because this is an October 2020 CDC presentation. Preliminary list of VAERS adverse events of special interest that they themselves denoted as potentially being caused, that they were worried the COVID-19 vaccine could cause. Look at that list. That list includes all of the issues, many of the issues that we now see from COVID-19 vaccine. October 2020, remember the first COVID-19 vaccine wasn't authorized and rolled out until December of 2020. That's 2 months before. Next slide, please. It's even worse. This is version 1 of the V-Safe protocol from November 19, 2020. Let's take a look at this list. And what is this list? It is the adverse events of special interest. This is CDC's own document. This is their protocol for designing V-Safe. What they call pre-specified medical conditions. And what do they have on the list? Anaphylaxis, coagulopathy, Guillain-Barré syndrome, myocarditis, pericarditis, seizures, stroke, transverse myelitis. So many of the issues and harms we are seeing. The CDC itself identified all of these harms as adverse events of special interest in a table they called pre-specified medical conditions before V-Safe was rolled out. That's their document. There's a link right there. You go see it for yourself. But yet not one of these ended up as check the box options. Neither these actual conditions nor any of the symptoms of these conditions. Not one. You know, it's hard to show premeditated bad conduct. Like when you want to charge a criminal defendant, it's hard to show scienter, like a criminal state of mind, purposely doing something. When they identified themselves in version 1 of V-Safe, all these potential harms, and then chose to then not include them. This is their own design protocol for V-Safe. To me, that shows premeditated conduct on their part in terms of how they chose to design V-Safe. But it is directly in accord with how they do vaccine safety for 37 years. Next slide, please. Okay, so the check the box symptoms, that first category stuff, totally useless to assess safety. Now, in a system called V-Safe, you would think that it should be able to assess what? It does have the word safe in it, right? Okay, and the V, I assume, means vaccine, safety, okay. So you would think. So it's not going to be in the check the box symptoms data. The only other data they collected to check the box is what they called health impact, in which they asked users, 1, you could check unable to work, 2, unable to do your normal daily activities like go to school, or 3, get care from a doctor or other healthcare professional. And if you click that you needed care from a doctor, then it had a sub list that you could see there. Did you need telehealth? Was it urgent care? Was it emergency room? Or was it hospitalization? Okay, so here you have it. This must be where they figured out the safety issue, right? You designed Z-Safe, you put it out there, you said to the American public, we're using millions of your taxpayer dollars to create this massive system called V-Safe. We're going to roll it out. We got 10 million users, and we're going to assure you, don't worry, America, this product's safe. We're going to assess it with the data in this system. Well, it's not the symptoms checklist because that was collected for 1 week. And by the way, the numbers were like 60, 70%, 40% of users reported those symptoms, and CDC said, all good. Okay. So then it must be here. It's got to be here. This was collected for that first week, up every week up to 6 weeks, and then at 12, 24, and 52 weeks. So maybe the CDC had to have some threshold where people said, hey, I had to seek medical care after the shot. And they're not reporting medical care because they're reporting medical care because they believe it's related to the vaccine. And remember, these are the vaccine enthusiasts that signed up for V-Safe. So what was that threshold? 1 in 100? 1 in 1,000? 1 in 50? 1 in 20? Like there's got to be a number where the CDC goes, that's it. We got to pull the plug. We got to pull the plug. Too many people are reporting needing medical care, hospitalization, emergency room, right? You would think there's got to be some threshold. Okay. Let's look at what the CDC disclosed to the public regarding this data for a year and a half first, when we were fighting with them in federal court to get it. Next slide, please. And then we'll look at what the data showed. These are over 40 studies relying on VSafe and VAERS data that the CDC put out. You can click on all these links. You can read them yourself. That's every single one we can find. All of them. This is the body of science that the CDC relied upon to say COVID-19 vaccines are safe. Don't worry. And almost all of them rely upon VAERS data and VSafe data. Here's the thing, though. For the VSafe data, they only disclosed the very first week of people reporting those health impacts. That's it. They never disclosed second week, third week, fourth week, fifth week, sixth week. And anybody who does vaccine injury work in the Federal Court of Claims knows vaccine injuries, numerous accepted, uncontroverted vaccine injuries like Guillain-Barré syndrome, transverse myelitis, COPD, often take at least a week, if not, and weeks to manifest. If you're going to have an autoimmune reaction, it takes a while before you have autoantibodies, self-antibodies to build up in your body to have that reaction. It doesn't happen within 24 hours after the shot. It takes time. They knew that 1 week of safety data, limited 1 week, was not going to be reflective of actual safety. But they limited it to 1 week. Study after study after study after study in which they told you this shot was safe. While we were in federal court for a year and a half fighting to get them to release all the check the box data. This is all the American public was told. And when they finally capitulated, next slide, please. This is what the data showed. 7.7% of VSafe users reported needing medical care. 7.7%. By the way, 500,000 of those users never filled out a single survey. I'm not even backing those out, but if you did, it would be over 8%. So said they needed medical care. And on average, they sought it 2 to 3 times, not just once, 2 to 3 times. And 70% of the time, over 70%, they reported needing urgent care, emergency room, hospitalization. The rate's 4.2% in the first 6 weeks for those who don't like the fact that they collected at 12, 24, and 52 weeks, by the way, even though they're pretty clearly only asking if the person thinks it's related to the COVID-19 vaccine. Does that maybe help explain why they didn't release that data during the year and a half and the over 40 studies they published regarding VSafe data? Apparently that wasn't the high enough rate for them to pull the plug on the shot. That number represents probably the very best data point that you're ever going to get on the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines because it's over 10 million users. It's collected from people who are in a standardized form, unfiltered by the pharmaceutical companies. And that is the rate of people who are sitting in medical care 2 to 3 times on average, and over 3 out of 4 approximately needing to go to the hospitalization, emergency room, or urgent care. There was another, by the way, 25% who reported missing school or work or not being informed of normal daily activities. So in all, that's 32% of VSafe users reported a health impact. If I recall correctly, one of the arguments for why they had to mandate this shot, like members of the military, was to make sure people didn't miss work and didn't, could be we could have a stand-up ready military force. Got 32%. I don't think that, young, fit men in the military and women in their 20s, I don't think 32% were taken out because of COVID from being able to perform normal daily functions. But apparently, on average, 32% were after the COVID-19 vaccine. Next slide, please. This is just one example from that data, and then we'll move on. So when you data mine in the VSafe data, you can actually see this is Pfizer's vaccine, okay? And what you can see here is that for 3 years and older, that's just the way they stratified the data. Thank you. That reported seeking medical care after the first dose. Now, between days 1 and 7, which is all the CDC would have told you, all it told the public, 0.32% sought medical care. Between days 8 and 14, this is not cumulative. Okay, this is not cumulative. Another 0.67% of VSafe users sought medical care. And then look at the increasing intervals. Okay? Again, those are not cumulative numbers. That is the percentage of VSafe users in each of those time intervals that were seeking medical care according to the VSafe data. That should have made alarm bells go nuts. Instead, they hid this data from the public and forced. Only reason they gave it out is because of 2 federal lawsuits demanding it. Next slide, please. So that's FAERS and that's VSafe. I was asked to talk about those 2 safety systems, and now you have my view and my my judgment on those. Again, I'm not judging the CDC based on what it said. I'm judging it based on what it did regarding those 2 safety systems. I'll talk about one last topic, and then I'll close this out. So the other, so we talked about deaths, and now let's talk about the other thing that they claim justified the vaccine mandates in particular, and that's that it prevents transmission. Right? Here's the thing, and eventually, as everybody here knows, they eventually effectively capitulated. No, the COVID-19 vaccine can't prevent transmission. Right? And so here is Rochelle Walensky, soon to be the former head of the CDC. You saw them going out and acting surprised that the COVID-19 vaccine, oh my, doesn't prevent transmission. The reality is most of the non-live vaccines like COVID-19 vaccine don't prevent transmission. This should have been absolutely no surprise that this vaccine doesn't prevent transmission. Look at the other vaccines that are non-live for respiratory infections. And they should have well known. In fact, it would be really difficult for me to believe they didn't know that it was highly unlikely this vaccine would prevent transmission. Next slide. For example, here's the pertussis vaccine. Okay, this is the other common respiratory infection non-live vaccine we give in America. Pertussis vaccine does not prevent infection and transmission. It just doesn't. That's not me saying it, by the way. These are all the premier, pharma paid, many of them pharma funded and paid scientists regarding pertussis vaccine in effectively what you call a consensus paper about whether pertussis vaccine does not prevent transmission. What was happening is that the way you judge how much circulating pathogen there is the interepidemic intervals. When the interepidemic intervals get narrower, that means there's more circulating pathogen. When they get wider, that means there's less. With pertussis, they seem to be staying the same or getting narrower. So the FDA finally did a study where they tried to look at whether the vaccine prevents infection transmission, and oops, they concluded it does not. And all the studies afterwards reconfirm that. And here you have, quote, this is a consensus paper from, Dr. Catherine Edwards, by the way, is one of the authors on this, and she would not put her name on almost anything that says something bad about a vaccine. But there she is. She's considered a pertussis vaccine expert, by the way, as well. She says acellular pertussis vaccine cannot avoid infection transmission. Acellular pertussis vaccines do not prevent colonization. Consequently, they do not reduce colonization of Bordetella pertussis and do not exert any herd immunity effect, end quote. There's a citation to the paper. Not to bore anybody, but the pertussis bacteria has about 3,000 antigens on its surface. The vaccine has 5 of those antigens. Having immunity to those 5 antigens apparently reduces symptoms. All the studies show it definitely reduces symptoms, apparently. But what it doesn't do is it cannot prevent colonization, multiplication of the bacteria in your nasopharynx. You shed it. You're transmissible for just as long, whether you had the vaccine or not had the vaccine, and even worse. If you had the vaccine, that first immune response that you've been primed with the vaccine causes something called linked epitope suppression. You will have that same defective immunity over and over and over again. It makes you a chronic carrier to shed pertussis for the rest of your life, versus those people who've actually had pertussis. They have immunity to the entire pertussis bacterium. They do not, when they come infected, are able to then shed and transmit. Again, read the study. I'm not saying that. I'm just a lawyer. I just read. That's what they all say. You can read it for yourself. Next slide, please. They knew this about other vaccines too. Polio vaccine, the holy grail of vaccines. There are 2 types of polio vaccines. There's a Salk vaccine developed in 1955 that's injected in the arm, creates immunity, systemic immunity, what they call in the bloodstream. And then there is the Sabin vaccine developed in 1961 that is the oral vaccine. Okay, the oral vaccine creates immunity in your intestinal tract, IgA antibodies, versus the injected vaccine, which only creates immunity in your bloodstream. Here's the thing about polio. It's infected from fecal to oral contamination. So if you want to stop transmission, you got to stop the virus from able to multiply in your intestinal tract. The inactivated polio vaccine, the only vaccine given to children in this country for over 2 decades, does not in any way stop the infection and transmission of polio, the virus. You have only received an inactivated polio vaccine, an IPV vaccine, which is only given in America for over 2 decades now. You develop IgG antibodies in your blood, but you do not develop immunity in your intestinal tract. Don't take my word for it again. I'm just a lawyer. I just read. That's what the studies show. This is the collaboration between the CDC and WHO to eradicate polio. And here's what they say. And Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you got to believe everything they say. UNICEF, it says, quote, IPV induces very low levels of immunity in the intestines. As a result, when a person immunized with IPV is infected with wild poliovirus, the virus can still multiply inside the intestines and be shed in the feces, risking continued circulation. IPV does not stop transmission of the virus, end quote. Not my words. That's the CDC, the WHO, Rotary, UNICEF, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If you have an issue with that claim, take it up with them, not me, please. And I'm not trying to take issue with the polio vaccine. I'm just pointing out, again, it doesn't stop infection and transmission. It shows that they know these vaccines. Let's just do two others. There you can see the quote about diphtheria vaccine from CDC scientists. Again, diphtheria vaccine only creates immunity to something released by, doesn't matter. Meningococcal vaccine, same thing. The point is, those are just examples. Going into this COVID-19 vaccine universe, these pharmaceutical companies, health authorities are well aware that most inactivated vaccines don't stop infection transmission. They don't contribute to herd immunity. They should not have been surprised unless they're, I guess, maybe Dr. Rochelle Walensky, maybe she, I'll actually give her the benefit that she knows nothing about vaccines. Okay. And they didn't know this, but they shouldn't have been surprised, but yet they are. Next slide, please. And here's the part that's really problematic from my perspective. They could have easily tested for whether or not COVID-19 vaccines prevent infection or transmission in the clinical trial. They were telling every American to test. Millions of test kits were being, shipped to everybody. They were giving out free test kits. Remember this period of time when the clinical trials were going on? All you had to do in the clinical trial is pick a few thousand people in the vaccinated group, a few thousand in the placebo group, and just test them every few days or once a week for 2-3 months, and then check the rates of positivity between the two groups. You would have known. You would have known whether or not it prevents infection transmission, and you would have had data on whether or not it causes linked epitope suppression. And for example, once you roll the vaccine out, will it increase cases? Because when you look around the world, look at developed countries that use the shot versus countries that didn't use the vaccine. Where do cases explode? Oh, that's just correlation. Come on. It's just correlation. Doesn't mean anything, right? Exactly. Countries that used the COVID vaccine had exploding cases. Countries that did not, many of them, you did not see that explosion curve. Could it be that the COVID vaccine not only caused increased circulation? Because think about it. If it reduces symptoms, but it doesn't prevent infection transmission, who's likely to more walk around? The unvaccinated person that gets COVID and spread it, or the vaccinated person? The unvaccinated person's got more likely to have symptoms, right? They say. Where is that person? At home, in bed. The vaccinated person they're not having symptoms. Where are they? They're roaming around. Who's more likely to spread? And if the COVID vaccine causes linked epitope suppression, meaning that immune response to just the spike protein results in you being able to have less symptoms, but does not, but primed you such that you always had that same defective immune response over and over again, it made you a constant, basic potential being infected and transmitted every time you come into contact with COVID. They knew about that science. Why didn't they rule it out? They could have. Millions of tests. They didn't have a few extra thousand to spare in the trials. All right. Last slide, please. With all of that said, the critical issue from my perspective is recognizing these are just products. Vaccines are not given by God at Sinai. They're just products. There is what public health authorities tell you about their safety and efficacy, and then there's a reality to what that actually is. There is a reality. It exists out there somewhere, but I know where you can't look to find it. And why that's critically important is this. They use the claim that these products are safe and effective to mandate them, to make you get them under penalty of losing your job, not being able to go to school, not being able to participate in civil society. Like I said before, you want a COVID vaccine? Great. You should be able to get it. As many shots as you want. But if somebody has concluded they do not want it and they cannot leave their house, and they cannot get a job, and they cannot go to school, and they cannot participate in civil society, then they don't have any rights. What good is the right to freedom of speech alone in your house? The right to assemble alone in your house? The right to religion alone in your house? You got all your constitutional rights, but you only exercise them by yourself. That's why informed consent, the ability to say no, is a fundamental right. No government should ever coerce anybody to have to take a medical product, period, ever. So here's the thing about mandates. You don't need to mandate something that's safe and effective. You don't need to. We'd all die if we don't drink water. Nobody needs to mandate us to drink. We would all die if we don't eat food. Nobody needs to mandate us to consume food products, buy them, go to the supermarket, get them, bring them home, cook them, consume them. It has always been the tools of those in power that when they cannot persuade you on the merits, they resort to what? Coercion, bullying, mandates. When you look at the long line of issues with vaccines that I've just gone through, maybe some of those resonate you, maybe they don't. You're a parent, you're making a decision for yourself. Maybe you look at the clinical trial data and you say, whoa, I don't know about 5 days of safety. Maybe I don't want to use that product. Or you look at the post-licensure safety studies and you say, whoa, I'm not comforted by those. I'm not comforted by those. Or you look at the lack of immunity and go, you know what? If the company that makes this product won't stand behind its safety, maybe it's unwise to consume that product. There might be a myriad of issues you have with one or more products. At the end of that long line, that long litany of issues, okay, is the ability to say no. That is the last stop on the train that you can use to protect yourself and your children and your family. When you go into a doctor's office, you've now been informed and you don't consent. Overriding that decision with bullying, mandates, coercion is what dictators and bullies and thugs have done throughout the ages. And it's exactly what this country was founded against. The whole idea of individual and civil rights in the Constitution was a rejection of the idea that somebody else, some dictator, monarch, king, central committee, knows better than you on how to make decisions about your life. When the founding fathers created the Bill of Rights and they were adopted in 1791 in the United States of America, times weren't easy. You think 1791 in America was an easy time? There's no running waters, no plumbing, there's no electricity. Times were hard. And those rights were written not only for that time, they were written for the harder times than that. And Americans cast away those rights with abandon as soon as some fear came about in the early 2020. We got to remember how fundamental the American experiment, individual rights are to the American experiment. It is, in my view, the central core feature of what distinguishes America from everything that preceded it. It is the idea that we respect individual rights. Individuals can cast off, choose their own risks, cast off, make their own destiny, not decide somebody else make decisions for them. Because once you do that, who makes that decision? Always the government, some central authority, the FDA, the CDC. And you can see exactly what that's wrought during this pandemic. And if we let the idea that you can coerce a medical product take hold on the adult population, pharmaceutical companies are really smart. They're going to load as many products as they can into that model. That is something that needs to be fought against, in my view, tooth and nail. Not the products, the mandate of the products. The products themselves, leave that to the medical folks to take issue with. But the mandates are what need to be stood against. Even for those, and I'll end with this, even for those that maybe like the COVID, maybe sitting in this audience who say, you know what, I love the COVID vaccines. They're great. I love every vaccine. I love masks. Wonderful. The day may come when you don't like a medical product. Maybe you love every mandated medical product today, so you don't have an issue. You can participate in civil society. You can have all your quote unquote rights in that context. But the day may come when you don't want a medical product. And if you cede those rights now, rights ceded are rarely returned. That's why everybody, whether you love mandated medical products or not, should really appreciate and understand you can't let these things be mandated. You got to always persuade on the merits. And if you can't, that's the end of the story. Thank you.